The sun-baked streets of Bakersfield shimmered in the late afternoon heat as Dr. Meredith Hawkins cruised through a quiet residential neighborhood. Her silver hair, neatly tied back, caught the sunlight streaming through the car window. At 55, Meredith's face bore the gentle lines of a life spent caring for animals, her keen eyes constantly scanning her surroundings out of habit. It was supposed to be her day off, a rare moment of respite from the bustling veterinary clinic she'd run for the past 2 decades. But for Meredith, the well-being of animals was never far from her thoughts. As she turned onto Maple Street, a flash of golden fur caught her eye, and she instinctively slowed her car. There, in a sun-scorched yard, lay a sight that made Meredith's breath catch in her throat. A golden retriever, its coat matted and dull, was chained to a rusted post. The dog's ribs protruded sharply against its skin, a stark testament to neglect. Its water bowl, tipped over and dry, lay just out of reach. Meredith's hands tightened on the steering wheel. In all her years as a vet, scenes like this never failed to stir a deep, visceral response in her. Without a second thought, she pulled over, her mind already racing with possibilities and concerns. As she stepped out of her car, the oppressive heat hit her like a wall. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and something less pleasant, the unmistakable odor of an animal in distress. Meredith approached the fence cautiously, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. The golden retriever lifted its head weakly, eyes dulled by resignation. But as Meredith drew closer, a tiny spark of hope seemed to flicker in those soulful brown eyes. The dog's tail, little more than skin and bone, thumped weakly against the parched earth. "Hey there, sweetheart," Meredith called softly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the stifling air. The dog's ears perked up slightly, responding to the kindness in her tone. It was a small gesture, but it tugged at Meredith's heart, cementing her resolve. She glanced around quickly, noting the peeling paint on the house, the overgrown lawn strewn with junk. No signs of life within. No car in the driveway. Meredith's jaw set with determination. She wouldn't leave this poor creature to suffer any longer. With practiced ease, she vaulted over the low fence, her sensible shoes crunching on the dry grass. As she approached, the full extent of the dog's condition became painfully clear. The chain around its neck had rubbed the fur raw, leaving angry red marks. Its once beautiful coat was now a mess of tangles and burrs. "Oh, you poor thing," Meredith murmured, kneeling beside the golden retriever. Up close, she could see it was a female, probably no more than 3 or 4 years old. Despite her condition, the dog managed to lift her head, nuzzling weakly against Meredith's hand. The gesture nearly broke Meredith's heart. Here was an animal that had every reason to distrust humans, yet still responded to kindness. It strengthened her resolve. She had to act, and act now. Meredith hurried back to her car, her mind racing. She always kept a basic emergency kit in her trunk, force of habit from years of unexpected house calls. But what she needed now was something else entirely. Her eyes fell on the small toolbox tucked in the corner of her trunk. Perfect. Grabbing the toolbox, she rushed back to the yard. The golden retriever watched her approach, a glimmer of curiosity breaking through its lethargy. Meredith knelt once more, running a soothing hand over the dog's head as she examined the chain. It was thick and rusted, secured with a heavy padlock. Meredith's lips thinned into a determined line. She'd seen chains like this before, used on junkyard dogs or in illegal fighting rings. The thought made her blood boil, but she pushed the anger aside. Focus on the task at hand. From her toolbox, she pulled out a sturdy pair of bolt cutters. It wasn't standard veterinary equipment, but Meredith had learned long ago that being prepared for anything was part of the job. She positioned the cutters carefully, mindful not to startle the dog. "Easy now, girl," she murmured soothingly. "We'll have you out of this in no time." The chain was thick, and Meredith's arms strained with the effort. Sweat beaded on her brow, but she persevered. With a final grunt of effort, the chain gave way with a satisfying snap. The golden retriever seemed to sense the change immediately. She lifted her head, eyes widening as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Meredith gently removed the remains of the chain, her fingers ghosting over the raw skin beneath. "That's it, sweetheart. You're free now," Meredith said, her voice thick with emotion. The dog's tail wagged with a bit more energy, and she attempted to stand on shaky legs. Meredith's heart soared at this small victory, but she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. She needed to get this dog to her clinic for proper treatment. As she pondered the best way to lift the weakened animal, a car door slammed nearby, shattering the quiet afternoon. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The angry shout made Meredith's blood run cold. She turned to see a man storming towards her, his face contorted with rage. This had to be Silas Thornton, the property owner, and he was clearly not happy to find a stranger in his yard. Meredith stood, positioning herself between the advancing man and the golden retriever. She raised her hands in a placating gesture, hoping to defuse the situation. "Sir, I'm Dr. Meredith Hawkins, a veterinarian. I don't care who you are," Silas bellowed, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. "You're trespassing on my property and messing with my dog." Meredith stood her ground, even as her heart raced. She'd dealt with angry pet owners before, but something in Silas's eyes spoke of a deeper, more volatile anger. "Your dog is severely neglected and in need of immediate medical attention," she said, fighting to keep her voice calm and professional. "As a veterinarian, I have a duty to—" "Duty?" Silas spat the word out like a curse. "Your duty is to mind your own damn business." He was close now, close enough for Meredith to smell the stale scent of cigarettes on his breath. His hands were balled into fists at his sides. Meredith's mind raced, assessing her options. She could try to reason with him, but the wild look in his eyes suggested that logic wouldn't prevail. She could attempt to leave with the dog, but in its weakened state they wouldn't get far. As Silas took another menacing step forward, Meredith braced herself for the worst. But then, something unexpected happened. A low growl rumbled through the air, stopping Silas in his tracks. Meredith looked down in astonishment to see the golden retriever struggling to her feet, placing herself between Meredith and the advancing threat. Despite her weakened state, the dog's stance was protective, her teeth bared in a warning snarl. It was as if all the mistreatment she had endured had been momentarily forgotten in the face of this new danger, not to herself, but to the kind human who had shown her compassion. Silas hesitated, clearly taken aback by this turn of events. The dog he had chained up and neglected was now standing against him, defending a stranger. It was a moment of beautiful irony that wasn't lost on Meredith. Taking advantage of Silas's momentary confusion, Meredith acted quickly. In one fluid motion, she scooped up the golden retriever, her veterinary training allowing her to lift the large dog despite her own smaller frame. The dog didn't resist, seeming to understand that Meredith was her best chance at escape. "This animal needs help," Meredith said firmly, already backing towards the fence. "I'm taking her to get the care she needs. You can expect to hear from animal control." Silas, snapping out of his shock, lunged forward with a roar of anger. But Meredith was already moving, her adrenaline lending her speed. She managed to maneuver over the fence, the golden retriever cradled protectively in her arms. Her car was just steps away, and Meredith silently thanked her past self for leaving the back door open. She gently placed the dog on the back seat, her hands shaking slightly as she heard Silas crashing through his yard behind her. Meredith slammed the car door shut just as Silas reached the fence. Without a backward glance, she jumped into the driver's seat, her fingers fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she pulled away from the curb with a screech of tires. In her rearview mirror, she could see Silas shouting and gesticulating wildly, but his words were lost in the rush of wind and the pounding of her own heart. Meredith took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves as she navigated through the residential streets, putting distance between them and danger. A soft whine from the back seat drew her attention. The golden retriever had managed to sit up, her eyes fixed on Meredith with a mixture of exhaustion and what could only be described as gratitude. Despite the gravity of the situation, Meredith felt a smile tugging at her lips. "It's okay, girl," she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're safe now. We're going to get you all fixed up." Do you think Meredith made the right decision by taking the dog away from its owner? What would you have done in her place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. As Meredith drove towards her clinic, her mind was already racing with next steps. The dog would need immediate medical attention, of course, but there would also be legal implications to deal with. She had, after all, just taken someone's dog, regardless of how justified her actions were. But looking at the brave, resilient animal in her back seat, Meredith knew she'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them. For now, what mattered most was getting this courageous dog the help and care she so desperately needed and deserved. The streets of Bakersfield flew by as Meredith pressed on, her determination growing with each mile. This was more than just a rescue. It was the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. And somehow, despite the uncertainty ahead, Meredith felt a sense of peace. She had done the right thing, and with this brave dog by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The tires screeched as Meredith pulled into the parking lot of her veterinary clinic. Her heart was still racing, adrenaline pumping through her veins from the confrontation with Silas. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, her focus immediately shifted to the golden retriever lying exhausted in the back seat. "We're here, girl," Meredith said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Let's get you fixed up." With gentle hands, Meredith lifted the weakened dog from the car. The retriever's ribs were prominent under her matted fur, and she whimpered softly as Meredith carried her into the clinic. The cool air inside was a stark contrast to the sweltering Bakersfield heat. "Dr. Hawkins?" Lisa, the young receptionist, looked up in surprise. "I thought it was your day off. Oh my goodness." Her eyes widened as she saw the state of the dog in Meredith's arms. "Emergency situation, Lisa," Meredith said briskly. "Call Dr. Rodriguez. Tell him I need assistance in exam room 2 right away." As Meredith laid the golden retriever on the examination table, she began a thorough assessment. The dog's eyes, though tired, followed her movements. There was trust there, mixed with a hint of fear. Meredith's heart ached at the thought of what this poor creature must have endured. "You're safe now," she murmured, running her hands gently over the dog's body, noting each area of concern. "We're going to take good care of you." Dr. Rodriguez burst into the room, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by professional focus as he took in the scene. "What have we got, Meredith?" For the next hour, the 2 veterinarians worked in tandem, cleaning wounds, administering fluids, and running tests. The golden retriever remained remarkably calm throughout the procedures, as if she understood they were trying to help. As Dr. Rodriguez finished bandaging a particularly nasty wound on the dog's leg, Meredith stepped back, taking a deep breath. "She's going to need ongoing care, but I think she's out of immediate danger." "Agreed," Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "But Meredith, where did you find her? This level of neglect, it's criminal." Meredith's jaw tightened. "It is, and I intend to see that justice is served." She turned back to the golden retriever, who was now resting more comfortably on the table. "But first, this brave girl needs a name. How about Zuri?" The dog's ears perked up at the sound, and her tail gave a weak thump against the table. "Zuri it is," Meredith smiled, the name feeling right. "It means beautiful in Swahili, and despite everything, that's exactly what you are." As if understanding the compliment, Zuri lifted her head and gave Meredith's hand a gentle lick. The simple gesture of gratitude brought tears to Meredith's eyes. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Lisa poked her head in, her expression worried. "Dr. Hawkins, there's a police officer here to see you." Meredith's stomach dropped, but she steeled herself. She had known this was coming. "I'll be right there, Lisa. Dr. Rodriguez, can you stay with Zuri?" Stepping into the reception area, Meredith found herself face to face with Officer Jenkins, a man she knew from various animal welfare cases over the years. "Dr. Hawkins," he greeted her, his expression a mix of concern and professionalism. "I've received a rather interesting complaint. A Mr. Silas Thornton claims you trespassed on his property and stole his dog. Care to explain?" Meredith took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew she had done the right thing morally, but legally? That was murkier territory. "Officer Jenkins, I'd be happy to explain everything. But first, I think you need to see something." She led the officer to exam room 2, where Zuri lay on the table, her condition speaking volumes. Officer Jenkins's eyes widened as he took in the scene. "This is the dog in question," Meredith said quietly. "I found her chained in Mr. Thornton's yard, severely neglected and in need of immediate medical attention. As a veterinarian, I couldn't in good conscience leave her there." Officer Jenkins nodded slowly, his expression grave. "I see. This certainly changes things. But Dr. Hawkins, you know there are proper channels for reporting animal abuse." "I do," Meredith agreed. "And believe me, I intend to file a formal report. But in that moment, Zuri needed immediate help. I made a judgment call." The officer sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I understand, but this complicates things. Mr. Thornton is threatening legal action." As they discussed the situation, Meredith's mind was already working on next steps. She knew she needed to gather more evidence, to build a case not just for Zuri, but for any other animals that might be suffering under Silas Thornton's care. Over the next few days, as Zuri recovered at the clinic, Meredith began a discreet investigation. She reached out to neighbors in the area, gathering statements about strange noises and smells coming from Thornton's property. She pored over county records, looking for any previous complaints or violations. What she uncovered shocked her to her core. Silas Thornton wasn't just a neglectful pet owner. He was running an illegal dog breeding operation. The pieces started to fall into place. The heavy chain, the secluded yard, the aggressive behavior. Thornton was likely breeding dogs for fighting rings. The revelation left Meredith reeling. She sat in her office late one night, Zuri curled up at her feet, wrestling with a profound ethical dilemma. She had evidence of a serious crime, but going public could jeopardize her own legal standing in Zuri's case. And what about the other dogs still trapped on Thornton's property? As she absently stroked Zuri's now clean fur, Meredith made her decision. She couldn't stand by and let more animals suffer. The next morning, she marched into the police station, a thick folder of evidence under her arm. Officer Jenkins listened intently as Meredith laid out her findings. His expression grew increasingly grim as she detailed the suspected breeding operation and the potential connection to dogfighting rings. "This is serious, Dr. Hawkins," he said when she finished. "We'll need to get a warrant and raid the property. But I have to warn you, your involvement in this could complicate things legally for you." Meredith nodded, her resolve firm. "I understand the risks, officer, but I can't turn a blind eye to this. Those dogs need help." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Meredith worked closely with the police, animal control, and fellow veterinarians to prepare for the raid. As dawn broke on the day of the operation, she found herself in a police van, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. The raid was swift and decisive. As officers swarmed Thornton's property, Meredith's worst fears were confirmed. In a dilapidated shed behind the house, they found dozens of dogs in various states of neglect. The stench of urine and feces was overwhelming, and the whimpers and barks of terrified animals filled the air. Silas Thornton was led away in handcuffs, shouting threats and obscenities. But Meredith barely noticed him. Her focus was entirely on the animals. She moved from cage to cage, assessing each dog's condition, her heart breaking anew with each discovery. For hours, Meredith and her team worked tirelessly, providing emergency care and preparing the dogs for transport to various shelters and veterinary facilities. As the last animal was loaded into a transport van, Meredith finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. Officer Jenkins approached her, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You did good work here, Dr. Hawkins, but I hope you're prepared for what comes next. Thornton's lawyer is already making noise about your initial actions with Zuri." Meredith nodded, exhausted but resolute. "I am, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." In the weeks that followed, Meredith's life became a balancing act between caring for the rescued dogs and navigating the legal aftermath of her actions. The local media picked up the story, painting her as both a hero and a vigilante. She faced questioning from the veterinary board and had to defend her decision to take Zuri without going through proper channels. But through it all, Meredith found strength in the animals she had saved. Zuri, now fully recovered, became a constant presence at her side, a living reminder of why she had taken such risks. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Meredith stood before the judge, Zuri at her feet as a therapy dog. As she recounted the events that led to Zuri's rescue and the subsequent discovery of the breeding operation, she spoke not just for herself, but for every animal that had suffered at Thornton's hands. The judge listened intently, his eyes occasionally dropping to Zuri, who sat calmly, her golden coat now shining with health. When Meredith finished, the courtroom was silent for a long moment. Finally, the judge spoke. "Dr. Hawkins, while I cannot condone taking the law into one's own hands, I also cannot ignore the tremendous good that has come from your actions. The evidence against Mr. Thornton is overwhelming, and the lives you've saved are testament to your dedication to animal welfare." He paused, looking down at Zuri once more. "I am dismissing all charges against you, Dr. Hawkins, and I commend you for your bravery in bringing this operation to light." The courtroom erupted in applause. Meredith felt tears of relief and joy streaming down her face as she knelt to embrace Zuri, who responded with enthusiastic licks. As they left the courthouse, Meredith was met by a group of supporters, many holding signs with pictures of the rescued dogs. Among them was a familiar face, Lisa, her receptionist, holding a squirming puppy. "Dr. Hawkins," Lisa called out, beaming. "Look who's here to say thank you." The puppy in her arms was one of the youngest rescues from Thornton's property. Once malnourished and terrified, it now wriggled with excitement, its tail wagging furiously. Meredith took the puppy in her arms, laughing as it covered her face with kisses. Zuri sat patiently at her feet, looking up at the scene with what could only be described as a doggy smile. In that moment, surrounded by the tangible results of her actions, healthy, happy dogs and grateful supporters, Meredith knew that every risk, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been worth it. As the sun set over Bakersfield, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Meredith looked down at Zuri, the dog who had started it all. "What do you say, girl? Ready to go home?" Zuri's tail thumped against the pavement, her eyes shining with trust and affection. Together they walked towards Meredith's car, ready to start the next chapter of their journey, one filled with hope, healing, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and the dog she had risked everything to save.